New numbers are out this morning on Canada's economy. The latest government data shows Canada's gross domestic product was essentially unchanged in November.
Some surprising, encouraging numbers today when it comes to Canada's economy. Statistics Canada says the real gross domestic product, or GDP, rose 2.6%.
Something remarkable is happening, and most of the world barely noticed. A middle power with deep historical ties to its giant neighbor is quietly redefining its place in the global order. Canada, long viewed as the United States' closest ally and economic partner, is stepping out of the shadows and asserting itself on the global stage in ways that challenge the assumptions of traditional power politics. This isn't about shouting headlines or symbolic press conferences. It's about strategic choice, economic diversification, and a shift in the fundamental logic that has governed Canada to U.S. relations for generations. In an era marked by rising trade tensions, disruptive tariff threats, and unpredictable foreign policy from Washington, Canada is navigating a new path, and the world is finally paying attention. For decades, Canada and the United States enjoyed one of the most integrated economic relationships on the planet. More than 3/4 of Canadian exports flowed south into the U.S., while American goods, tourists, and capital poured north. From automotive parts to energy to consumer goods, the two economies were so intertwined that many analysts treated them almost as a single market. But those assumptions are now unraveling. The recent upswing in tariff threats, from steel and aluminum duties to aggressive stances on sensitive sectors like aerospace and agriculture, has exposed how easily economic integration can be weaponized in political conflicts. The upshot? Canada is beginning to question the wisdom of depending so heavily on a single partner. Prime Minister Mark Carney, a former central banker and international finance figure, has become the face of this transformation. In a widely discussed speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Carney argued that the old rules-based order that once anchored global stability is no longer dependable. He called for middle powers to rethink how they engage with larger states and to pursue cooperation among themselves to safeguard economic interests in the face of volatile great power politics. For many, this was not mere rhetoric. It was a strategic guidepost for a new era. Carney's message struck a chord because it reflected a reality many governments were already feeling. Trade rules no longer guarantee protection, and dependence creates exposure. In the months since, Canada has moved to put those ideas into practice. Ottawa has launched policies aimed at strengthening domestic economic integration by eliminating internal barriers between provinces, streamlining labor and goods movement, and boosting internal capacity. These efforts are intended to make Canada less vulnerable to external shocks, especially from the United States, where trade policy has become increasingly unpredictable. The IMF has estimated that removing internal trade barriers within Canada could boost real GDP by as much as 7%, underlining the economic upside of such reforms. But Carney's vision goes beyond internal policy. He has set ambitious goals to double Canada's non-U.S. exports over the next decade, signaling a clear intent to diversify global trade relationships. Canada already has one of the most extensive networks of free trade agreements of any G7 country, covering more than 1 billion consumers worldwide. Yet the strategic focus now is on reaching beyond North America into Asia, Europe, and Latin America. Trade diversification is already underway. Canadian businesses are increasingly redirecting exports to markets like the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Germany, where recent data shows significant increases in demand. At the same time, exports to the U.S. have softened in the face of tariffs and political tensions, a trend that underscores shifting trade patterns. Thousands of Canadian enterprises are reporting that nearly half of them no longer view the United States as a reliable trading partner, and more than half are actively seeking diversified suppliers and markets. These changes are not theoretical. They are emerging in real business decisions. One of the most visible expressions of Canada's global push has been its outreach to Asia. Carney's recent visit to India, for example, was part of efforts to negotiate a comprehensive economic partnership agreement that could expand bilateral trade to $50 billion by 2030. These talks covered not just goods and services, but also strategic sectors like defense, technology, and energy, signaling a deeper economic relationship that reduces reliance on a single partner. According to diplomats, this outreach is designed to parallel Canada's diplomatic engagement with countries across Africa, Europe, and Latin America as part of a broader diversification strategy. This shift has not gone unnoticed in Washington. The Trump administration, in particular, has reacted sharply to Canada's outreach to China and other markets, even threatening punitive tariffs if Canada pursues deeper trade with Beijing. U.S. officials dismiss much of Canada's repositioning as political noise. But behind that rhetoric lies genuine concern about losing economic influence over its northern neighbor as Ottawa seeks alternatives to American markets. Canada's pivot is occurring alongside broader global shifts. U.S. trade policies have become more protectionist, with average tariff rates hitting their highest levels in decades, reshaping global trade flows and pushing exporters to reroute goods to avoid punitive duties. This has opened space for countries like Canada to rethink their trade strategies and reduce vulnerability to U.S. policy swings. But this transformation is not purely economic. It reflects a deeper strategic confidence rooted in Canada's strengths. In recent speeches, Carney has highlighted Canada's position as an energy superpower, a leader in critical minerals, and a hub for advanced technologies like artificial intelligence and quantum computing. These capabilities provide Canada with leverage in global markets that extend far beyond traditional manufacturing or raw materials exports. They offer a foothold in high-value, future-oriented industries that are less dependent on U.S. demand and more responsive to global opportunities. At the same time, Canada's political brand, grounded in pluralism, human rights, and democratic institutions, carries soft power that resonates internationally. Polls show that Canada is often seen as a constructive global actor, generating goodwill that translates into diplomatic capital. In a world where global trust in American leadership has weakened, this international perception matters. Canada is increasingly perceived as a positive force on issues ranging from climate change to peacekeeping to equitable trade practices. This soft power enhances Canada's appeal as a partner in a fracturing global order. Yet even as Canada expands its global footprint, there are real challenges and criticisms. Some analysts warn that diversifying away from traditional partners, especially into markets with weaker human rights records, could compromise Canada's values. Engaging deeply with authoritarian or semi-authoritarian countries can bring economic opportunity, but it also requires careful balancing to avoid undermining Canada's commitment to democratic principles and international norms. Critics argue that economic diversification must not come at the expense of core values that define Canada's political identity. Others expand on the complexity of reducing U.S. dependency. Geography, integrated supply chains, and sheer market scale mean that the U.S. will remain a dominant trading partner for Canada for years to come. A complete decoupling is neither practical nor desirable. Yet the strategic intent is clear. Canada seeks to balance its relationship with the U.S. rather than hinge entirely upon it. This nuanced approach reflects a recognition that economic resilience in the modern world requires multiple avenues of engagement, not monolithic dependency. Domestic developments complement Canada's global strategy. Ottawa has worked to eliminate internal trade barriers, strengthen industrial policy, and invest in future-oriented sectors. Policy initiatives aimed at boosting internal economic resilience, including infrastructure spending, advanced manufacturing incentives, and investment in research and development, form the foundation of Canada's ability to compete globally. These efforts are designed to ensure that Canadian firms can innovate, grow, and operate effectively in a multipolar trade environment. The upcoming review of the USMCA trade agreement further underscores the importance of Canada's recalibrated strategy. With looming negotiations and contentious rhetoric from Washington, Ottawa is entering these talks from a position that is less deferential and more assertive. Prime Minister Carney has declared that the review will be robust, signaling that Canada is prepared to defend its interests vigorously while pursuing a diversified international agenda. Canada's rising role on the global stage is not a rejection of its history with the United States. The U.S. remains a key trading partner, security ally, and neighbor with deep cultural ties. But the assumption that Canada's prosperity depends exclusively on American markets has given way to a more strategic viewpoint. True strength lies in flexibility, diversification, and collaboration with a broader set of global partners. This shift is not just pragmatic. It represents a fundamental recalibration of Canada's place in a world where power is no longer concentrated in a singular axis. In navigating this new era, Canada is writing a different narrative, one where middle powers are not passive followers in a U.S.-led order, but active architects of their own economic and diplomatic destinies. It's a transformation driven not by defiance alone, but by the practical recognition that today's global landscape demands agility, resilience, and the courage to forge new pathways in a world of uncertainty.